Imagine you're sitting inside an airplane. Not on the ground, not taxiing slowly down a runway. You are already airborne, already deep over the Pacific Ocean, already thousands of feet above water so cold that if you fell into it, you would be dead in minutes. You are part of a bomber crew. The mission is real. The enemy is real. And somewhere in the back of your mind, somewhere you refuse to let fully surface, is the knowledge that the aircraft holding you aloft is not really a warplane at all. It started as something else, something commercial, something meant for businessmen and diplomats and mailbags, not bombs and machine guns and naval warfare. And the men who built it, the men who sold the idea of it, knew its weaknesses better than anyone. They just never told the men who flew it. This is the story of the Mitsubishi G4M, the airplane the Allies called the Flying Lighter, the airplane Japanese aircrews called, with the kind of dark humor that only comes from genuine terror, the Type 1 lighter, a machine so catastrophically flammable, so tragically underprotected, so philosophically flawed at its very foundation, that it became one of the deadliest aircraft to its own crews in the entire Second World War. But to understand how Japan ended up flying a commercial reject into the most brutal naval air war in human history, you have to go back further. You have to go back to a boardroom in America, to a sales pitch that failed, to an airplane that nobody wanted to buy, and what one empire did when it got desperate enough to try anyway. If you've ever wondered how decisions made in peacetime echo into wartime catastrophe, if you've ever been fascinated by the strange, hidden connections between commerce and carnage, between engineering arrogance and human tragedy, then stay with me, because this story goes places you will not expect. And if stories like this, the forgotten corners of the Second World War, the untold engineering disasters, the human beings swallowed by machines and decisions they never fully understood, if those stories matter to you, then take 2 seconds right now and subscribe to this channel, because this is exactly what we do here, every single week. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The year is 1934. The world has not yet gone to war, but it is practicing. Japan has already invaded Manchuria. Germany is rearming under a new chancellor who speaks in thunderclaps. And in the United States, the Douglas Aircraft Company is trying to sell an airplane. The aircraft is called the DC-1. It is, by every objective measure, a remarkable machine. Clean lines, twin engines, retractable landing gear, enclosed cabin. It flies faster and farther than anything else in commercial aviation. Douglas is proud of it. Douglas is certain the world will want it. But the world is complicated in 1934. TWA, the airline that commissioned the DC-1, only ever buys one, just one, because Douglas immediately improves it, lengthens it, calls it the DC-2, and starts selling that instead. The DC-1 is already obsolete before it truly begins, and somewhere in the shuffle of capitalism and aviation progress, a Japanese delegation arrives in the United States with money in hand and questions in mind. Japan in the mid-1930s is a nation of enormous ambition and chronic anxiety. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the Kaigun, is one of the most powerful maritime forces on Earth, but it is perpetually haunted by the distances of the Pacific. The Pacific Ocean is not merely large, it is incomprehensibly, almost insultingly vast. The distances between island chains, between fleet anchorages, between potential enemies are measured not in miles, but in days. In a war, the Navy that could strike first, strike farther, and strike harder would hold an advantage that no amount of battleship armor could overcome. The Kaigun's air staff understands this with absolute clarity. What they need is a long-range, land-based bomber, not a dive bomber, not a torpedo plane launched from a carrier, a true heavy bomber that can be based on land, fly enormous distances over open ocean, find enemy fleets and destroy them before those fleets can ever reach Japanese waters or Japanese territory. But before Mitsubishi finalizes the G4M's design, something interesting happens. Something that has received never the attention it deserves in most Western tellings of this story. A Japanese trade mission examines the Douglas DC-2. They study its construction. They note its wing design, its approach to fuel efficiency, its aerodynamic philosophy. The DC-2 doesn't become the G4M. The lineage is not that direct, but the influence is real. The Japanese aviation engineers of the 1930s were voracious students of Western technology, and the American commercial aviation boom of that decade fed directly into Japanese military aviation in ways that American manufacturers never anticipated and never intended. There is something almost poetic and deeply tragic about that exchange. America, in its commercial energy, its drive to connect cities and continents, inadvertently handed tools to a military machine that would one day use those tools against American sailors. By 1937, the prototype is flying, and it is, in the most purely technical sense, a triumph. The G4M can do almost everything the Navy asked. The range is extraordinary. The speed is competitive. The aircraft handles well. Mitsubishi's engineers look at what they have built and feel genuine pride. But the men who will actually fly this machine into combat, the ones whose names will never appear in engineering reports, already have questions. Questions about what happens when an enemy puts a bullet into one of those enormous, unprotected fuel tanks. Questions about the thin aluminum skin stretched over a frame that has been carved down to almost nothing in the name of weight reduction. Questions that, in 1937, with no war yet formally declared, and with the Navy brass dazzled by performance numbers, feel almost impolite to ask out loud. The G4M's wings contain integral fuel tanks, meaning the fuel lives inside the wing structure itself, surrounded by nothing more than the wing skin and a few internal ribs. There is no self-sealing rubber lining, no fire suppression system, no armor around the tanks. A single tracer round from an enemy fighter punching through that thin aluminum skin at the right angle would turn the wing into a torch. Honjo's team had actually proposed a version with protected tanks early in the design process. The Navy rejected it. Too heavy, the range would drop, and range was everything. "We cannot sacrifice range for crew safety," a Naval Air Staff officer is reported to have said during one of the design reviews. The statement was not cruel. It was not the product of malice. It was the product of a military doctrine that had decided with terrible certainty that strategic reach mattered more than the men holding the throttles. The G4M would become the physical embodiment of that doctrine, and the men who flew it would pay for that decision with their lives. The first time the G4M enters combat, it does so over China. The Second Sino-Japanese War is already raging, and the Navy wants to use its new long-range bomber to strike Chinese targets that land-based fighters cannot protect. The results are initially intoxicating. G4Ms fly missions of astonishing length, crossing distances that no other bomber of the era could cover, striking targets deep inside Chinese territory. The Navy is thrilled. The pilots are exhausted but proud. And then the Chinese start putting up resistance, and the G4M's fatal flaw begins to reveal itself. The first time a Chinese fighter puts sustained cannon fire into a G4M's wing tanks, the airplane doesn't just catch fire, it explodes. A full wing simply ceases to exist in a matter of seconds. The crew, 9 men who woke up that morning, who ate breakfast, who wrote letters home that were still in transit, are gone in a single catastrophic orange flash.
Word filters back through the crews. It filters back through the maintenance crews on the ground who patch the returning aircraft and count the holes and understand what those holes mean. It filters back, eventually, to Mitsubishi and to the Navy. The Navy's response is instructive. They do not ground the aircraft. They do not send it back for redesign. They note the vulnerability, they acknowledge the problem, and they continue flying missions, because the alternative, admitting that the cornerstone of their long-range naval air strategy was built on a fatal compromise, was not a conclusion that institutional pride could permit. New nicknames begin to circulate among the men who fly her. Hamaki, the cigar, because of her long, rounded fuselage, yes, but also because of how she burns. And then comes December 1941, and the entire world changes. In the early hours of December 8th, December 7th in Hawaii, but December 8th in the Philippines and Malaya, Japan launches simultaneous strikes across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The scale of it is breathtaking. Pearl Harbor burns, British airfields in Malaya are struck, Hong Kong is attacked, and over the South China Sea, formations of G4Ms take off from bases in southern Indochina and fly south. Their target is Force Z. Force Z is the British Royal Navy's response to Japanese aggression in Southeast Asia. Two of the most powerful warships in the world sailing to defend Malaya. HMS Prince of Wales, one of the newest and most heavily armored battleships on Earth. HMS Repulse, a battlecruiser of enormous speed and firepower. Together with 4 destroyers, they have sailed from Singapore to intercept Japanese invasion convoys off the Malayan coast. The British admiral commanding Force Z, Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, is a man of fierce courage and, fatally, considerable contempt for Japanese air power. He does not believe that high-altitude bombers can sink maneuvering warships at sea. He has studied the statistics, he trusts the math. He sails north without air cover, convinced that the threat from the sky has been overstated. In the early hours of December 10, 1941, the G4Ms find Force Z. What happens next is one of the most consequential 90 minutes in naval history. The Japanese attack in coordinated waves. High-level bombers come first, forcing the ships to maneuver violently, burning their speed, exhausting their anti-aircraft gunners. Then the torpedo planes. G4Ms carrying the Type 91 aerial torpedo approach low and fast from multiple angles. The Prince of Wales tries to turn. She takes multiple torpedo hits. Her machinery is crippled. She begins to list. Repulse fights with desperate ferocity. Her captain, William Tennant, puts her ship through maneuvers that seem almost impossible for a vessel that size. He combs torpedo tracks. He turns into attacks. He screams his commands into the speaking tube with the controlled fury of a man who knows exactly what is happening and refuses to accept it. For a while, for a miraculous, brutal while, it seems like Repulse might survive. She doesn't. In the water afterward, British sailors cling to debris and watch as Japanese aircraft circle overhead. Some of the G4M crews drop life preservers to the men in the water. It is one of those strange, almost unbearable human moments that war occasionally produces. Enemies, separated by nationality and uniform and weeks of industrial killing, sharing a single gesture of recognition that underneath it all, they are men. Both ships go down. 840 British sailors die, and in one morning, the age of the battleship as the supreme arbiter of naval power ends forever.
Winston Churchill, sitting in bed in London when the news arrives, will later write that in the entire war, nothing gave him more shock and grief. Not the fall of France, not Dunkirk.
the loss of those two ships. And the aircraft that delivered the killing blow, the torpedo-carrying G4Ms, are celebrated across Japan. The name Mitsubishi rings out in newspapers and radio broadcasts. The long-range, land-based bomber has proven its worth in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The Navy's doctrine, the doctrine that traded crew safety for range, that built a flying lighter and sent men to fly it, that doctrine has been validated. For now. The problem with dramatic early victories is that they create a kind of institutional blindness. Success is intoxicating. It is also, in military history, frequently the first step toward catastrophe. The G4M's performance at Force Z had occurred under nearly ideal conditions. The British ships had no air cover. The sea state was favorable. The Japanese air crews were experienced, well-trained, and flying a coordinated attack that had been rehearsed for months. The conditions would never be that favorable again. In the months following Pearl Harbor, as Japan's rapid conquest of Southeast Asia and the Pacific continued, the G4M flew everywhere. It struck the Philippines, it attacked Darwin in northern Australia, it hunted shipping across thousands of miles of ocean. And for a brief, dazzling period, it seemed invincible. Then the Americans got their fighters airborne. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat was not a beautiful aircraft. It was stubby and slightly ungainly, and its pilot visibility was not ideal. But it had self-sealing fuel tanks. It had armor plating behind the pilot's seat. It had 6 50-caliber machine guns that could put 800 rounds per minute into a target. And when American Wildcat pilots discovered what a few of those rounds did to a G4M's wing tanks, the news spread through the fleet fighter squadrons like wildfire. The G4M is a flamer. You hit the wings, you step back, you watch. American fighter pilots began calling it the Flying Lighter, officially in after-action reports, a plane so combustible that it had earned its nickname not from propaganda, but from direct, repeated, and horrifyingly consistent experience. For the Japanese crews flying these missions, the knowledge of their aircraft's vulnerability was a constant, grinding psychological weight. Every mission briefing, every takeoff, every long transit over open ocean with nothing beneath them but water that would kill them in minutes if they went down, all of it was shadowed by the awareness that a single enemy fighter, if he caught you at the wrong angle, could end everything in a second. Some crews coped with dark humor. The word hamaki, cigar, was said with a grim grin, the kind of grin that means something entirely different from amusement. Some coped with discipline, with the ritualized focus that Japanese military culture demanded. Some, undoubtedly, did not cope at all, and simply flew each mission in a private fog of suppressed terror that they never showed and never discussed. One surviving G4M pilot, interviewed decades later, was asked what it felt like to know your airplane could burn so easily. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We did not think about it. If you thought about it, you could not fly, so you did not think about it." That is what institutional doctrine looks like from the inside of a cockpit. That is what happens when the men who make the decisions about aircraft design never have to sit in the seats they are designing. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 is usually and correctly described as the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan loses 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of irreplaceable trained pilots, and the strategic initiative in a single catastrophic 4-day engagement. But within that larger story of carrier warfare and dive bombers and extraordinary luck, the G4M plays a role that is rarely examined in detail. On the morning of June 4, 1942, as the Japanese carrier strike force approaches Midway Atoll, American defenders on the island launch every aircraft they have. Among them are Marine Corps aviators flying a mix of obsolete aircraft, Buffalo fighters, Vindicator dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo planes that are barely out of the factory. They fly into the teeth of the Japanese combat air patrol and take catastrophic losses. But also among the attacking aircraft are Army Air Force's B-17 flying fortresses, flying high-altitude attacks on the Japanese fleet. And flying alongside them, attempting torpedo attacks on Japanese warships, are more American aircraft. The Japanese carriers maneuver wildly. Most American attacks miss. The G4Ms operating from Midway itself fly strikes on the Japanese fleet and suffer devastating losses. The American Combat Air Patrol, finally in the air, finally positioned correctly, tears into the slow, straight, and level torpedo runs that the attack doctrine demanded. G4M after G4M catches fire and crashes into the sea. By mid-morning, the atoll-based G4M force is badly mauled. The losses are staggering. And later that afternoon, when the dive bombers of Yorktown and Enterprise find the Japanese carrier force with its decks loaded with rearming aircraft and 3 carriers die in 5 minutes, the G4M's role in the battle fades into the larger catastrophe of Japan's strategic defeat. But those burning G4Ms in the water off Midway, those are part of the story too. Those are 9 men each. Those are crewmen who knew their aircraft burned, who flew straight and level anyway because the doctrine demanded a stable torpedo run, who saw the American fighters turning to intercept and understood with mathematical clarity what was about to happen. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is flying a cigar-shaped torch toward an enemy warship because your country asked you to and your training left you no other vocabulary. As 1942 becomes 1943 and the Pacific War grinds into its terrible middle phase, the phase of attrition and island hopping and nightly naval battles in the slot around Guadalcanal, the G4M's limitations become an increasingly acute crisis for Japanese naval aviation. Mitsubishi knows the aircraft has problems. The Navy knows the aircraft has problems. Everyone knows. But the industrial situation making anything about it enormously difficult. Japan's industrial base, impressive as it was by the standards of Asian nations in the 1930s, cannot compete with America's. The United States has shifted its entire economy to war production with a speed and scale that is literally without precedent in human history. The factories are running 24 hours a day. The raw materials are flowing. The trained workers are multiplying.
Japan cannot keep pace. Japan cannot replace its aircraft losses as fast as America can replace its aircraft losses. Japan cannot replace its trained aircrew losses as fast as America can train new aircrews. The mathematical reality of industrial warfare is beginning to assert itself with the cold, grinding inevitability of a glacier. The G4M is updated. Gradually, reluctantly, the Navy accepts the weight penalties and installs self-sealing fuel tanks in later variants. Defensive armament is improved. A 20mm cannon is added to the tail position. The engines are upgraded. Each modification makes the aircraft heavier, which reduces range, which was the entire reason the thing was built the way it was in the first place. Each modification is an acknowledgement, written in aluminum and rubber and new engine specifications, that the original doctrine was wrong. But the crews who flew the original G4M, the ones who climbed into an aircraft with unprotected tanks and insufficient armor because the Navy needed reach more than it needed survivability, those men are not here to see the improvements. Most of them are not here at all. There is a name that has to enter this story now, a name that carries so much weight in the history of the Pacific War that to speak it is to feel the narrative shift and deepen. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto is the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack.
He is the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. He is also, in the spring of 1943, the most recognizable military figure in Japan, celebrated, mythologized, treated as a figure of almost supernatural strategic genius. He is also, privately, a man who had opposed the war with America from the beginning, who understood America's industrial capacity in a way that few in the Japanese military establishment permitted themselves to understand, who once said, famously, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve." He has said these things, he knows them to be true, and he continues to fight the war anyway because duty and loyalty and the Imperial Japanese military system leave him no other option. In April 1943, American signals intelligence, the codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii, intercept a detailed itinerary of Yamamoto's inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The itinerary specifies dates, times, routes, aircraft types. It is a gift of almost impossible richness. And Admiral Chester Nimitz has to make a decision that is more complex than it appears. Killing Yamamoto will be a blow to Japanese morale. It will remove the architect of Japanese naval strategy. These are military benefits of enormous potential value. But killing him will also risk revealing to Japan that America has broken their naval codes. If Japan changes those codes, and they will change them if they suspect a break, the intelligence advantage that has allowed America to fight above its weight for 2 years could vanish overnight. Nimitz weighs the options. He consults. He makes his call. Operation Vengeance is approved. On the morning of April 18, 1943, 16 P-38 Lightning fighters take off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The Lightnings are the only American fighters with the range to make the intercept. They fly low over the water to avoid Japanese radar, 400 miles, hedge-hopping at wave-top height, throttles set to maximize range, pilots alone with their thoughts and the steady drone of 2 Allison engines each. At 9:34 in the morning, they climb to intercept altitude over Bougainville. And there they are. 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers, the aircraft chosen to carry Yamamoto and his staff because of their long range, with 6 Zero fighters as escort. Flying on schedule, flying on the exact course the intercept message predicted, flying with the terrible punctuality that characterized Yamamoto himself, directly into the ambush. What happens next takes less than 3 minutes. The Lightnings attack. The Zeros react. In the confusion of that initial engagement, 2 P-38s peel off and go for the bombers. 1 G4M, Yamamoto's aircraft, begins to smoke from the left engine. It noses down. It descends toward the jungle below Bougainville at a steep angle. It goes into the trees. It burns. Yamamoto is found the following day in the wreckage, still strapped into his seat, still in his dress uniform, sword at his side. He has been hit by machine gun fire. Death was probably instantaneous. He did not burn. The airplane burned around him, but he did not burn. Japan's greatest admiral dies in a G4M, the aircraft that embodied every compromise of Japanese naval doctrine, the aircraft that traded lives for range, that burned when it shouldn't, that carried men to their deaths because an institution's pride wouldn't acknowledge its own mistakes. That aircraft carries Yamamoto on his last flight. The symmetry is not poetic. It is tragic, in the deepest, most Greek sense of the word. News of Yamamoto's death is kept secret in Japan for weeks. When it is finally announced, the grief is genuine and enormous. Yamamoto had been a figure of such stature, such singular prominence, that ordinary Japanese people had constructed a mental model of the war that depended on his continued existence. If Yamamoto is there, the logic ran, Japan is guided by genius. Japan cannot lose. And now, Yamamoto is gone. His ashes are transported back to Japan on a warship. There are state funerals, there is public mourning on a scale that the government both encourages and struggles to control, because grief of that magnitude is politically complicated. Too much grief implies too much vulnerability. Too much mourning for a single man implies that without him, the cause is weakened, which of course it is. The replacement commanders are capable men. They are not Yamamoto. They do not have his grasp of the entire strategic picture. They do not have his willingness to think unconventionally, to challenge assumptions, to design operations that turn the expected logic of naval warfare on its head. They are men doing their best in an impossible situation, flying an increasingly losing strategic hand with professionalism and courage, and without the cards they need to win. The G4M continues to fly. There are now enough variants, enough modifications, that some of them are genuinely improved. The G42, with the more powerful engines and marginally better protection, is a meaningfully better aircraft than the original, but the improvement is incremental. The fundamental problem, the philosophy of range over survivability, the institutional conviction that crew safety is a secondary consideration, that problem has not been solved. It has been acknowledged and partially addressed and then accepted as the price of doing business in a war that Japan is running out of resources to fight. By late 1943 and into 1944, the Pacific War has entered its brutal, grinding final phase. The American island-hopping campaign is systematically cutting Japan's supply lines and destroying her defensive perimeter. Every island that falls is another airfield, another stepping stone, another tightening of the strategic noose. Every G4M lost is a crew of 9 men and an irreplaceable aircraft that Japan's strained production cannot easily replace. The mathematics are relentless. They always are.
In the Philippines in 1944, as the American Liberation Campaign reaches its terrible climax at Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history, the G4M is pressed into roles that its designers never anticipated. Night attacks, low-level torpedo runs against heavily defended targets, and something new, something that speaks to how desperate Japan's situation has become. The Oka. The Oka, which translates simply as cherry blossom, is a rocket-powered manned missile. A pilot sits inside a wooden fuselage packed with 1,200 kilograms of explosive. He has no landing gear, no return provision. He will ride his aircraft into an enemy warship, and the aircraft and the pilot and the warship will cease to exist together. And the G4M is the aircraft chosen to carry the Oka to its launch point. Think about what this means. An aircraft that already burns like paper, an aircraft that already has inadequate defensive armament, an aircraft that already asks its crew of 9 to accept a degree of risk that no Western Air Force would have tolerated. Now it must fly, with a rocket-powered suicide bomb slung beneath its belly, through fighter cover and anti-aircraft fire dense enough to black out the sky, close enough to a target that the Oka pilot can guide himself the rest of the way. The G4M carrying an Oka is slower than a G4M flying without one, much slower. The combination is heavy and aerodynamically awkward. It cannot maneuver. It cannot escape. It flies toward the target zone, hoping, because hope is the only operational resource it has left, that it can get close enough before the American Combat Air Patrol finds it. The American pilots who encountered G4M Oka combinations described the experience with a kind of horrified disbelief. The G4M is already slow. With the Oka, it is glacially slow. Killing it is not difficult. What is difficult is the emotional and psychological residue of knowing what is inside, that a human being is strapped into the bomb you are about to shoot down, that the man piloting the Oka chose this, that his family knows he chose this and calls it honorable.
that the entire culture that produced him has constructed an apparatus of meaning around the act of dying in this particular way. Most Oka attacks fail. The G4Ms are shot down before they can release. The American fighter cover is too dense, too well organized, too lethally effective. Of the attacks that do result in a successful Oka release, some miss. Some are shot down by anti-aircraft fire. A handful find their targets. On April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, the American invasion of Okinawa begins, the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. And in the weeks that follow, the kamikazes and the Okas and everything Japan has left to throw come at the American fleet in waves of organized self-destruction. The U.S. Navy suffers its worst losses of the entire war during this campaign. Dozens of ships are hit. Hundreds of sailors die. The psychological impact on American crews who watch, day after day, as airplanes fly deliberately into their ships, that impact is beyond ordinary measurement. But the G4M Oka combination, for all its intended terror, sinks no major warships. The mathematics of the exchange are brutal in a different way than the Kaigun expected. They cost Japan trained pilots, trained G4M crews, irreplaceable aircraft, in exchange for damage that, however real and painful, does not alter the strategic balance. The war continues to be lost. There is a moment in the spring of 1945, not a famous moment, not a moment that appears in most histories of the Pacific War, that I want to slow down and stay with for a minute. Somewhere in the Western Pacific, a G4M crew is preparing for a mission. The details don't matter exactly. They are composites of dozens of real missions flown in those final months. What matters is the texture of the moment. The pilot is 24 years old. He has been flying G4Ms for 3 years. He has survived the battles in the Solomons. He has survived Rabaul. He is one of the most experienced naval aviators Japan still has, which means he has watched most of the men he trained with die. He knows the aircraft's weaknesses better than any engineer. He knows what happens when the tanks catch fire. He has pulled people out of the water who described it. He does his pre-flight check. He checks the engines. He checks the fuel. He runs his eyes across the aluminum skin of the wings and thinks about what is inside those wings and does not think about what he is thinking. He climbs into his seat. His co-pilot settles in beside him. 7 more men take their positions throughout the aircraft: the navigator, the bombardier, the radio man, the gunners. They run up the engines. The noise fills everything. The aircraft trembles. Someone, it might be the navigator, it might be the radio man, it might be no one in particular or a collective memory assembled from the letters and diaries that survived. Someone makes a joke, the kind of dark, absurd joke that combat aviators make because the alternative is silence, and silence in that particular moment would be unbearable. The pilot laughs. He pushes the throttles forward. The G4M rolls down the runway, heavy with fuel and bombs, and lifts reluctantly into the air. They will be over their target in 4 hours, or they will be dead in 4 hours. There is no third option that this war, in this year, in this aircraft, offers. That is what the doctrine of range over survivability looks like at the human scale. That is what it means to take a commercial design philosophy, to reject the modifications that would have saved lives in favor of the performance numbers that looked good on a specification sheet, and then to send 9 young men into a sky full of people trying to kill them. The Mitsubishi G4M was not a bad design. It was a brilliantly realized design that achieved exactly what it was asked to achieve and killed the men inside it in exactly the way everyone who understood it knew it would. It was an aircraft born of institutional pride and strategic desperation and the peculiar moral mathematics of a military culture that valued the mission above the man.
August 6, 1945. A B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay takes off from Tinian Island with a bomb in its bay that is unlike any bomb ever dropped in the history of warfare. The flight to Hiroshima takes 6 hours. The bomb falls for 43 seconds. 3 days later, a second bomb falls on Nagasaki. Japan announces its surrender on August 15, 1945. The formal surrender ceremony takes place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur oversees the signing. The representatives of the Japanese government and military step forward, sign the documents, and step back. And above the Missouri, flying in formation overhead as a symbol of Allied air power's final, total supremacy over the Pacific skies, are American aircraft, B-29s, hundreds of them, along with carrier aircraft from the fleet assembled in the bay. No G4Ms fly over Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. The survivors of that aircraft, the ones that haven't been shot down or burned or crashed into the sea, are grounded. They will be surveyed by American technical teams in the weeks that follow. They will be examined, dismantled, studied. The Americans will note the construction. They will note the fuel tanks. They will note the absence of the protection that would have saved so many lives. Some of the American technicians will shake their heads, not at the Japanese for building it, but at the recognition that institutional doctrine, the kind of thinking that puts performance numbers above human lives and calls it strategy, is not uniquely Japanese. It is universal. It is what institutions do when they are more in love with their concept of the war than with the men they send to fight it. In the years and decades after the war, the G4M occupies a strange place in the memory of Pacific aviation. It is not celebrated the way the Zero is. It lacks the cultural cachet of Japan's famous carrier fighter. It is too obviously a failure, too nakedly a symbol of the compromises that led Japan from triumph to catastrophe, to be easily incorporated into a narrative of heroism. But the men who flew it were heroes, whatever that word means in the context of a war fought for causes that history has judged harshly. The men who climbed into those thin aluminum aircraft and flew them into combat, who flew straight and level on torpedo runs while fighters came at them, who carried Oka bombs toward American fleets knowing that the mathematical probability of their return was vanishingly small. Those men were brave. They were brave in a way that is almost impossible to fully comprehend from the comfortable distance of 80 years. They were brave and they were failed by a system that valued their deaths less than it valued their range, failed by an institutional culture that acknowledged the aircraft's fatal flaw and accepted it as a cost of doing business, failed by the gap between the men who make the decisions and the men who live or don't live with those decisions. That gap is not unique to Imperial Japan. It is not unique to World War II. It is one of the oldest and most persistent structures in the history of organized human violence. The men at the top of hierarchies design the systems. The men at the bottom inhabit them. And the distance between those two positions is not measured in rank or privilege alone. It is measured in fuel tanks without self-sealing liners, in aluminum skin thin enough to pierce with a rifle bullet, in cockpits without armor behind the seat. The G4M's story is Japan's Pacific War in miniature, a brilliant beginning, a decisive early victory, an institutional inability to acknowledge fatal weaknesses, a grinding attrition that slowly, inexorably shifted the balance, and at the end, men of extraordinary courage paying with their lives for decisions that men with considerably more to lose institutionally and considerably less less to lose personally had made in conference rooms and design reviews years before. The flying lighter, the cigar, the Type 1 lighter. Type 1 refers to the year of its introduction in the Japanese calendar, Showa 16, the 2601st year of the imperial calendar, which was 1941. Type 1 was the designation that appeared in official documents. The nicknames, the ones the crews gave it, tell a different story. The crews always know. They always know before anyone else admits it. They live inside the thing. They can feel what it is. There is one more story to tell, one more human thread to pull before this narrative finds its ending. After the war, a small number of former G4M pilots survived long enough to be interviewed by historians, by journalists, by their own grandchildren asking about the old photographs. The interviews are scattered across archives in Japan and the United States. They are not consistent. The men remembered different things. Some remembered the missions with a kind of detached clarity, as if the distance of years had turned it all into something that had happened to someone else. Some remembered with an emotion that never really left, that surfaced in the pauses between sentences and in the way their eyes moved when certain questions were asked. One of them, his name is in the archives, though it seems wrong to pull it out here, to make his private grief into a data point, was asked very simply, "Did you know the aircraft was dangerous?" He looked at the interviewer for a moment. He was in his 70s by then. His hands, in the photograph taken at the interview, are resting on a table. Steady hands, pilot's hands. "We knew. We always knew. We flew anyway. What else would we do? We were Japanese. We were naval aviators. Flying was what we did. The airplane burned. Men burned. You could not think about it and fly. So you flew and did not think about it. And afterwards," he paused, "afterwards, there was time to think." That pause, that afterwards, for most of his comrades, there was no afterwards. The G4M did not offer a generous proportion of afterwards to the men who flew it. The aircraft was a cigar, and cigars, eventually, burned down to nothing. What remains 80 years later is the lesson. Not a comfortable lesson, not a lesson that fits neatly into a story of heroism or villainy. A lesson about institutions and decisions and the men who live inside the consequences of other men's choices. When a society, any society, asks its young men and women to risk their lives in machines or systems or strategies, it owes them something. Not just gratitude, not just medals, not just the carefully managed public memory of sacrifice. It owes them the honest application of every available protection. It owes them the institutional humility to say we were wrong about this design, we were wrong about this doctrine, we will fix it, even if fixing it costs us performance, costs us fuel, costs us the elegant numbers on the specification sheet. The G4M never got that acknowledgement while it mattered. The improvements came too late, too slowly, under the weight of a culture that conflated admitting weakness with being weak. And the men who flew the unimproved versions, the ones who flew the original Hamaki with its naked fuel tanks and its thin aluminum skin, they paid the price for that conflation. They paid it over the South China Sea. They paid it at Midway. They paid it in the Solomons and over the Philippines and in the long, grinding, burning campaign that ended on the deck of a battleship in Tokyo Bay with documents being signed and the war finally over. They paid it so that future engineers in future wars might look at the records and understand the specification sheet is not the last word. The man in the cockpit has a vote too, and his vote is cast not in design reviews, but in the air,
at altitude, with enemy fighters turning to intercept, and 9 men in an aluminum tube wondering if this is the moment, this turn, this second, when the tanks finally catch and the world ends in orange light. If this story moved you, if the men who flew the cigar, the men who flew the Okas, the men who sat in the wreckage of the Prince of Wales and watched the Japanese aircraft drop life preservers into the sea, if any of that human weight landed somewhere real inside you, then you already know what kind of stories live on this channel. The Pacific War was not just carriers and code-breaking and atomic bombs. It was 9 men in a burning aircraft over open ocean. It was a 24-year-old pilot checking his fuel tanks before a mission he might not return from. It was a boardroom decision in